Before dawn, on June 6, 1944, the German defenses along the French coastline appeared flawless. Between the incoming tanks and the shore stood a lethal gauntlet. Cold water, hidden mines, thick concrete, steel hedgehogs, deep trenches, barbed wire, and narrow exits covered by overlapping enemy fire. It was a perfectly designed system meant to trap and destroy. But the Allies had no intention of fighting on the battlefield the Germans had so meticulously prepared. Instead, they brought strange, specialized machines designed to physically dismantle the terrain itself. How exactly do you dismantle a heavily fortified battlefield while under direct fire? The entire logic of the German defense relied on a brutal, mathematical certainty. The Axis commanders knew they could not build a continuous, impenetrable wall across thousands of miles of European coastline. Instead, they engineered highly concentrated, static kill zones. Every steel barrier, every anti-tank ditch, and every concrete bunker was precisely aligned to funnel ordinary infantry and conventional tanks into fatal choke points. If a standard Allied tank rolled off a landing craft, it would inevitably hit an obstacle, stall, and immediately become a stationary target for a pre-sighted 88mm artillery gun. The beach was not a simple line of defense. It was a trap meant to paralyze an advancing army in its tracks. The Allied commanders recognized that sending conventional armor into this pre-calculated slaughter would guarantee failure. You cannot outshoot a reinforced concrete bunker when your tank is permanently stuck in a coastal minefield. The solution required an entirely new doctrine of mechanized warfare. Hidden from German reconnaissance, the Allies manufactured a unique arsenal of bizarre, almost unnatural engineering vehicles. These machines were not built to fight enemy armor. Instead, each individual vehicle was created for one single purpose: to neutralize one specific type of lethal obstacle standing between the water and the French countryside. Operation Overlord was about to become a grueling, mechanical test of endurance. It was a direct collision between defensive engineering and offensive innovation. With the fate of the war hanging in the balance, the ultimate test was about to begin on the sand. Amidst all this overlapping concrete, thousands of tons of steel, and miles of buried explosives, which specific German obstacle would actually be the one to break the machines and stop the Allied invasion dead in its tracks? To understand the sheer scale of this mechanical nightmare, you first have to strip away decades of mythology. If you picture the Atlantic Wall, you likely imagine a colossal, uninterrupted fortress of solid concrete running seamlessly from the Spanish border all the way to the Arctic Circle. Nazi propaganda ministers loved this image. They wanted the world to believe that Fortress Europe was a literal wall, as solid and continuous as a hydroelectric dam holding back the ocean. But Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the man tasked with perfecting these coastal defenses in early 1944, knew the reality was far more pragmatic and ultimately far more lethal. The German High Command did not have the time, the raw materials, or the manpower to pour thousands of miles of continuous fortifications. Instead, the Atlantic Wall was a decentralized, highly adaptable system. It was a complex network of strongpoints, known as Widerstandsnester, which translated to nests of resistance. These were surgically placed clusters of bunkers, trenches, and artillery positions that did not fight in isolation. Their effectiveness depended entirely on exploiting the local geography. Where coastal cliffs provided natural defense, the German engineers simply placed observation posts and scattered machine gun nests. But where the beaches sloped gently toward the sea, the exact places an invading army would want to land its heavy armor, the engineers unleashed an industrial-scale system of interlocking fields of fire. The concrete was poured not to form a continuous barrier, but to create indestructible pivots. These pivots anchored a web of crossfire designed to shred anything that moved across the open sand. The brilliance of this defense lay in its ruthless economy. The German divisions stationed along the Normandy coast varied wildly in quality and strength. Some were battle-hardened veterans of the Eastern Front, while others were static coastal defense units or conscripts from occupied territories. Rommel understood that he could not rely on manpower alone to hold the line. The terrain itself had to be weaponized to do the killing. The obstacles were not scattered randomly. They were arranged as a precise, sequential trap. calculated to strip away an invading force's momentum layer by layer. In mechanized warfare, momentum is everything. If an armored assault slows down, it dies. The German engineers designed a gauntlet where every single obstacle forced the attacker to pause, shift direction, and expose their vulnerable flanks to pre-sighted artillery. This was not a wall to be climbed. It was a meat grinder designed to be activated by the enemy's own forward movement. To break through this system, an Allied tank crew would have to survive a strict, punishing sequence of escalating threats. And the very first obstacle was not made of concrete or steel. The first lethal barrier was the English Channel itself. Before a tank could even test its armor against a German gun, it had to cross miles of rough, unpredictable ocean. Delivering a 30-ton piece of steel onto a hostile shore under combat conditions was a monumental feat of physics. The vehicles had to survive the brutal surf and the nauseating pitch of landing craft, often flooding with freezing salt water before they even saw the coastline. The tides of Normandy are notoriously violent, swinging drastically and exposing vast stretches of wet sand or drowning the beaches entirely, depending on the hour. The Germans used this tidal clock against the Allies. Rommel ordered millions of obstacles placed exactly where the incoming high tide would hide them. If the Allied vehicles somehow survived the crossing and approached the shore, they immediately hit a submerged forest of steel and timber, designed to halt their momentum at the water's edge. There were the Belgian gates, massive 3-ton iron frames meant to tear the bottom out of a landing craft. Behind them stood thick wooden ramps, angled precisely toward the sea, with heavy teller mines strapped to their tips. A landing craft or an amphibious vehicle riding a wave would drop directly onto the detonator, vaporizing the machine and its crew in an instant. Closer to the shore sat the Czech hedgehogs, 3 heavy steel beams welded together at right angles. No matter how these hedgehogs tumbled in the surf, they always presented a sharp, impenetrable spike designed to wedge under a tank's chassis, ripping its tracks and pinning it hopelessly in the rising water. If a tank managed to navigate this flooded junkyard, splash off the ramp, and drag itself onto the dry sand, the nature of the threat immediately shifted. The water obstacles were designed to sink the invasion. The dry beach was designed to paralyze it. This was the domain of the minefield. By June 1944, millions of explosives had been buried along the French coast. While many were designed to shatter infantry, the heavy anti-tank mines were specifically calibrated to disable machinery. A tank did not need to be completely destroyed to be defeated. If a concealed explosive merely snapped a single track, that 30-ton machine instantly ceased to be an offensive weapon. It became a stationary steel coffin, trapped exactly where the German gunners wanted it. The artillery officers sitting in their concrete bunkers overlooking the beaches had spent months measuring the distances to every rock and dune. They had pre-registered their 88mm guns on the exact patches of sand where the minefields were laid. Their strategy was cold and mathematical. Let the hidden mines stop the tank from moving even a single meter forward, and then let the heavy artillery crack open the immobilized hull from a mile away. For the few surviving vehicles that somehow threaded the needle through the surf, bypassed the steel hedgehogs, and crawled untouched through the dense minefields, the ultimate physical barrier awaited at the edge of the beach. The sand did not simply merge into the French countryside. It ended abruptly at a massive seawall or a deeply excavated anti-tank ditch. These were sheer drops and vertical faces of earth and concrete, entirely impassable for a tracked vehicle. A conventional tank cannot climb a vertical wall. It cannot leap across a 20-foot wide trench. These barriers were designed as the final anvil upon which the Allied armor would be smashed. As the vehicles piled up against this impassable line, unable to advance, unable to retreat into the sea, they would bottleneck. And it was exactly at these bottlenecks that the heaviest, most concentrated German fire was focused. The exits from the beach, the narrow, winding draws leading up to the coastal roads, were deliberately blocked by thick concrete walls and guarded by disguised anti-tank guns, firing directly down the throats of the advancing forces. The entire system was an interconnected puzzle of death. The water trapped you on the sand. The mines stopped you from moving, the ditches prevented you from escaping, and the guns finished you off. This was the true nature of the Atlantic Wall. It was a sequential engineering problem that seemed to have no conventional military solution. How could standard machines possibly navigate this intricate architecture of destruction without being annihilated in the process? Standard machines couldn't. The Allied High Command understood that a conventional armored assault on these beaches would be nothing more than an expensive suicide mission. To solve the sequential engineering problem of the Atlantic Wall, they needed a sequential, mechanical response. The answer lay not in thicker armor or bigger guns, but in a radical transformation of the tank itself. Under the direction of British Major General Percy Hobart, the Allies developed a vanguard of heavily modified vehicles, famously known as Hobart's Funnies. They were bizarre, specialized beasts, each designed to answer a single specific German threat. The brutal reality of the morning of June 6th was that every inch of the beach demanded its own mechanical key. As the first waves ground onto the sand, the immediate, paralyzing threat was the buried explosive. German engineers had saturated the landing zones with heavy anti-tank mines and thousands of anti-personnel variants, creating an invisible grid of destruction. A tank didn't even need a direct hit to be neutralized. Snapping a single steel track instantly transformed a 30-ton assault weapon into a useless, stationary target for German artillery. To physically break this explosive grid, the Allies unleashed the Sherman Crab. At first glance, it looked like a grotesque agricultural machine. Mounted to the front of a standard Sherman tank was a heavy steel cylinder, powered by the tank's own engine. Attached to this cylinder were 43 heavy chain flails. When engaged, the drum spun violently, whipping the fixed steel chains into the sand at staggering speeds. The crab literally beat the ground to death, absorbing the explosive force of the buried mines with its flying chains rather than its vulnerable hull. As it crawled forward at a torturous 1.5 miles per hour, the flailing arms triggered mine after mine. The physical toll on the crews was immense. Inside the steel hull, the noise of the chains striking the earth, combined with the concussive shock of continuous, high-explosive detonations, was deafening. The spinning drum kicked up a blinding storm of sand, smoke, and pulverized earth, completely obscuring the driver's vision. Yet, through this violent mechanical chaos, the crabs carved narrow, safe lanes through the minefields, allowing the fragile infantry and conventional armor to follow in their tracks. But surviving the minefield only unlocked the next layer of the German trap. As the surviving crabs and standard tanks pushed past the explosive zones, they abruptly hit the anti-tank ditches and sheer concrete seawalls. A cleared path means nothing if it ends at a 20-foot chasm. The advance stalled. Bottlenecks immediately began to form, and pre-registered German mortars started zeroing in on the clustered vehicles. The invasion needed to cross the gaps, and human engineers carrying shovels and wooden planks would be slaughtered in seconds. The mechanical counter arrived in the form of specialized bridge layers and heavy carriers. Rolling out of the landing craft came modified Churchill tanks, stripped of their primary turrets and converted into armored beasts of burden. Some carried massive, unwieldy bundles of tightly bound wooden logs, known as fascines, a siege tactic dating back to the Roman Empire, now scaled up for industrial warfare. Approaching the sheer drop of an anti-tank ditch, these heavily armored engineers didn't stop to fight. They drove directly to the edge and unspooled their massive bundles into the gap, instantly filling the chasm with tons of compressed timber. Other specialized variants drove forward and unfolded prefabricated steel bridges directly over their own hulls, dropping them across the seawalls to create immediate ramps. Within minutes of hitting the obstacles, these machines had transformed impassable terrain into a functional road, allowing the invasion to resume its momentum. The mines had been beaten into submission, and the trenches had been bridged, but paving a road is not the same as surviving what is guarding it. The specialized armor was now pushing inland, straight into the interlocking fields of fire. What happens when a slow, heavy machine, built to drop bridges and clear mines, suddenly finds itself staring directly at a heavily reinforced concrete bunker that conventional weapons cannot crack? When that heavily modified Churchill tank rolled off the steel bridge it had just deployed over the anti-tank ditch, it found itself staring directly into the narrow firing slit of a German bunker that had completely survived the greatest naval bombardment in human history. This was the fundamental problem of the coastal fortifications. The German engineers of the Todt organization had poured bunkers with walls of steel-reinforced concrete up to 2 meters thick. Standard 75mm armor-piercing shells fired from conventional Allied Sherman and Churchill tanks, would strike the angled faces of these pillboxes and simply shatter, leaving nothing more than a superficial scorch mark and a shallow crater in the cement. The defenders sealed inside would barely feel the vibration of the impact. The entire German defensive doctrine at the edge of the beach relied heavily on this assumed invulnerability. If the concrete bunker survived the initial barrage, the heavy machine guns and anti-tank cannons housed inside survived. If those weapons survived, the Allied infantry, pinned down on the open sand, would be systematically annihilated in a crossfire. It was a brutal, inescapable mathematical equation of static defense. The British 79th Armored Division had anticipated this exact tactical dead end. The Allied commanders knew that you could not simply outshoot a hardened concrete fortress using standard mobile artillery. The vehicle, now slowly grinding its tracks toward the surviving bunker, was an armored vehicle Royal Engineers, universally known as the AVRE. At its core, it was a heavy Churchill tank, specifically chosen for its incredibly thick frontal armor, capable of absorbing a massive amount of punishment. But its primary turret gun had been entirely removed. In its place protruded a bizarre, stubby, oversized weapon known as a petard mortar, a massive 290mm spigot system. This weapon was not designed to fire conventional, high-velocity, armor-piercing shells. It was engineered for one highly specific, devastating purpose: to hurl a 40-pound, high-explosive demolition charge, affectionately and grimly nicknamed by the crews as the Flying Dustbin. The mechanics of operating this specialized weapon were terrifyingly primitive and required the crew to expose themselves to extreme danger. Unlike a standard tank gun, which was loaded safely from within the protected, sealed environment of the armored turret, the petard mortar had to be loaded from the outside. The co-driver, positioned down in the forward hull of the tank, had to physically unlatch and slide open a steel hatch directly above his head. In the middle of a raging firefight, with sniper rounds pinging off the heavy hull and mortar shrapnel filling the air with jagged steel, the co-driver had to push his hands, arms, and shoulders out of the safety of the tank. He would grab the heavy cylindrical dustbin charge, wrestle it upward onto the exposed spigot, lock the explosive firmly in place, and then instantly drop back inside, pulling the heavy hatch shut above him. He had to perform this desperate mechanical acrobatics while the AVRE was actively drawing the concentrated, furious fire of the very bunker they were attempting to destroy. Because the 40-pound flying dustbin was so incredibly heavy and aerodynamically unstable, the weapon had an extremely short effective range. To guarantee a hit, the tank commander had to maneuver his 38-ton machine through the chaotic, debris-strewn environment of the beach, crushing barbed wire and navigating around the bodies of the fallen to position the vehicle within roughly 80 yards of the concrete fortress. It was a terrifying, slow-motion game of chicken between a mobile steel box and a static concrete mountain, with German machine gun bullets sparking harmlessly off the AVRE's thick frontal plate. When the vehicle finally halted and fired, the massive recoil physically shook the entire chassis. The heavy explosive cylinder arced slowly through the smoky air and smashed directly against the vertical face of the bunker. The resulting explosion was catastrophic. The petard mortar did not necessarily need to punch a clean hole completely through the 2 meters of reinforced concrete to neutralize the threat. The sheer kinetic energy and massive explosive concussive force of the 40-pound charge transferring instantly into the wall caused a deadly physical phenomenon known as spalling. On the inside of the bunker, the immense shock wave traveling through the material shattered the inner layer of the concrete, instantly turning the walls of the pillbox into a deadly, high-velocity shotgun blast of jagged rock and twisted steel rebar. The enclosed, sealed space of the bunker briefly became a pressurized chamber of concussive force and flying debris, instantly incapacitating or killing the gun crews inside, without the explosive charge ever fully piercing the armor. The heavy machine guns would abruptly fall silent. The AVRE would then grind its gears, turn its heavy tracks in the sand, and slowly pivot to find the next active fortress, leaving a smoking, neutralized tomb in its wake. Inside the surviving observation posts overlooking the British and Canadian landing sectors of Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches, German officers and artillery spotters stared through their optical periscopes in a state of mounting disbelief. For years, these men had been trained in a rigid, inflexible doctrine of coastal defense. They possessed meticulously drawn range cards, mapping out every single yard of the sand below in lethal detail. They knew exactly how many seconds it would take an infantryman to sprint between the tide line and the shingle. They knew precisely where a conventional tank would be forced to halt its advance due to the terrain, and they had pre-registered their heavy inland artillery on those exact coordinates. The entire German defensive strategy was a highly calculated industrial mechanism, and the enemy soldiers and machines were supposed to be the raw material helplessly fed into that machine. But the mechanized vanguard currently rolling out of the landing craft was fundamentally breaking the established rules of engagement. The German defenders, relying on the hostile terrain to aggressively funnel the attackers into concentrated choke points, suddenly realized that the enemy armor was not playing its assigned role. German gunners watched in shock as strange, flailing tanks deliberately drove straight into the dense, heavily seeded minefields. Instead of detonating the hidden traps with their vulnerable tracks and stalling the advance, these machines actively sought out the explosives, safely detonating them with violently spinning chains that beat the ground into a cloud of pulverized sand. They saw heavy tanks approach deep, impassable anti-tank ditches that had taken German labor battalions weeks to excavate. Instead of stopping in confusion to be slaughtered by pre-sighted mortars, the specialized vehicles simply unfolded massive steel bridges over their own roofs or dumped tons of tightly bound timber directly into the abyss, instantly neutralizing months of defensive engineering in a matter of seconds. The psychological foundation of the Atlantic Wall was cracking under the weight of this specialized armor. The initial confidence of the German defenders, rooted in the belief that their obstacles were impassable, rapidly turned into genuine alarm. The officers peering through the concrete slits realized with terrifying clarity that the invading forces were not merely trying to fight the garrison soldiers. The Allies were systematically fighting the terrain itself. The impenetrable geometry of the coastline, which the Germans had heavily relied upon to act as an unyielding anvil, was being actively unwritten before their very eyes. An anti-tank ditch is only a weapon if it cannot be crossed. A minefield is only a barrier if it remains hidden and intact. The British and Canadian armor was actively rewriting the physical map of the battlefield under direct fire. The static mathematical kill zones were evaporating as the enemy paved their own roads over the soft sand and crushed the steel barricades beneath their heavy tracks. Yet, silencing the isolated bunkers and crossing the immediate frontline obstacles was only the first phase of a much larger extraction. The ultimate strategic goal of the morning was not merely to survive on the edge of the beach. It was to completely leave it behind. To succeed, the invasion forces had to push deep inland, which meant they had to funnel tens of thousands of men and thousands of vehicles through the incredibly narrow coastal draws and designated beach exits. The German engineers had fully anticipated this critical bottleneck. They had deliberately choked these narrow, vital roads with blasted concrete roadblocks, tangled forests of steel hedgehogs, and deeply excavated anti-tank walls. Furthermore, the massive naval bombardment that had preceded the landings had inadvertently churned the soft clay and loose sand around these exits into a deep, impassable quagmire of craters and mud. Conventional transport trucks, jeeps, and even standard tanks would instantly sink to their axles in the destroyed terrain, completely blocking the exit for everyone lined up behind them. A jammed exit was a death sentence. It meant the entire invasion force would back up onto the open beach, providing a dense, stationary, and helpless target for the heavy German artillery batteries firing blindly from the inland hills. To solve this critical logistical nightmare, the 79th Armored Division deployed one of the most unglamorous, yet absolutely vital, machines of the entire Second World War, the armored bulldozer. Based primarily on the heavy civilian Caterpillar D7 tractor, these were exceedingly slow, cumbersome vehicles, entirely stripped of any offensive weaponry. They did not carry heavy guns, machine guns, or petard mortars. Instead, they were heavily encased in thick, welded steel plating to protect the delicate engine block and the vulnerable driver, and they were fitted with massive, hydraulically operated steel dozer blades. The men operating these armored bulldozers performed a terrifying, highly isolated duty on the shoreline. The driver sat entirely alone inside a claustrophobic steel box with only narrow vision slits to see the chaos outside. manipulating heavy mechanical levers and winches. His job was not to shoot back at the enemy, but to completely ignore the raging battle unfolding around him and focus entirely on the brutal task of industrial earth-moving. While mortar shells rained down, sending geysers of wet sand into the air, and machine gun fire sparked continuously off his armored cab, the bulldozer driver pushed the heavy throttle forward. The massive steel blade bit deeply into the chaotic, ruined debris of the beach. The heavy tractor grunted and strained, its wide tracks slipping and then catching in the mud, slowly pushing aside the twisted, burning remains of destroyed landing craft and disabled tanks. It shoved 3-ton Belgian gates out of the designated path as if they were toys. It scooped up tons of loose sand, gravel, and rubble to hurriedly fill in the massive craters left by naval shells, creating a solid, tightly packed surface over the treacherous clay. These dedicated bulldozers were frequently joined by standard Churchill and Sherman tanks that had been field modified with their own heavy dozer blades bolted to their front hulls. Together, these machines attacked the heavily blocked exits with nothing but sheer mechanical horsepower and grinding momentum. They rammed repeatedly into concrete roadblocks, systematically pushing the heavy debris aside, inch by bloody, agonizing inch. They were forcibly carving functional roads out of absolute ruin. For the terrified infantry pinned down behind the shingle, watching an armored bulldozer slowly but relentlessly push an impassable wall of steel and concrete out of the way was a profound and surreal morale boost. This unarmed construction vehicle was single-handedly winning the vital battle of logistics, right in the middle of an intense firefight. By physically clearing the exits, these engineering vehicles released the immense pressure valve of the beach, allowing the trapped, vulnerable columns of armor and infantry to finally surge forward off the sand and into the French countryside. However, to understand the true nature of the assault, it is absolutely crucial to strip away the historical illusion that this was a flawless, invincible operation. The story of Hobart's Funnies is too often condensed into a neat, triumphant narrative of miracle machines effortlessly erasing the German defenses at the push of a button, rendering the enemy helpless. The brutal, unforgiving reality of the morning of June 6th was starkly different. These highly specialized machines were deeply vulnerable, and the crews locked inside them suffered horrific casualties to achieve their objectives. The beach was a sprawling, chaotic graveyard of broken, burning, and immobilized specialized armor. The heavy AVREs, weighed down by tons of extra welded armor, massive wooden fascines, and cumbersome bridge equipment, frequently bogged down in the treacherous, hidden patches of blue clay lurking beneath the top layer of sand. Once a 38-ton tank sank to its armored belly, its tracks spinning uselessly and churning the mud. It ceased to be an engineering marvel and instantly became a static steel coffin. The German anti-tank gunners, quickly recovering from their initial shock at seeing the bizarre vehicles, realized the immense tactical value of destroying these engineering assets. They immediately prioritized the bridge layers, flails, and AVREs as their primary targets. The deeply feared German 88mm anti-tank gun, highly accurate and capable of punching cleanly through heavy armor from over a mile away, tore mercilessly into the vanguard of the 79th Armored Division. A direct hit from a high-velocity shell on an AVRE carrying a fascine would often set the massive bundle of dry timber instantly ablaze. This turned the entire tank into a blinding, rolling bonfire, forcing the desperate crew to bail out of the hatches, directly into the withering machine gun fire sweeping the beach. Or still, the AVREs were packed tightly internally with the heavy, highly volatile demolition charges for the petard mortar. If a German armor-piercing shell managed to penetrate the thick hull and strike the internal ammunition storage, the resulting sympathetic detonation was absolutely catastrophic. The engineering tank would instantly vaporize in a blinding flash of light and a deafening roar, leaving nothing behind but a blackened, smoking crater and scattered, burning tracklings. The mine-clearing Sherman Crabs were equally vulnerable to the extreme violence of the environment. Hitting a deeply buried, double-stacked teller mine at an awkward angle could easily blow the entire heavy steel rotor arm clean off the front of the tank, rendering the flail completely useless and leaving the surviving crew stranded and immobilized in the exact center of a live, active minefield, perfectly sighted by enemy artillery. The entire operation was a calculated, bloody attrition of specialized machinery. The Allied commanders knew, before the ramps ever dropped, that they were going to lose hundreds of these invaluable engineering tanks. But the grim, unforgiving mathematics of the coastal assault dictated that even a destroyed engineering vehicle was often considered a tactical success, provided it died only after doing its specific job. If a Sherman Crab managed to flail a safe, narrow lane through 200 yards of a dense minefield before its tracks were finally blown off by an explosion, that single lane was now permanently open for the following infantry to exploit. If an AVRE was critically immobilized by anti-tank fire but managed to drop its steel bridge across a seawall right before the crew bailed out of the burning hull, the vital route was secured for the conventional armor waiting behind it. Even the burning, wrecked hulls of the bogged down and destroyed tanks served a crucial, unintended purpose, providing vital steel cover for the terrified infantry advancing up the exposed beach. The courageous crews of these specialized machines essentially traded their lives and their vehicles for yards of cleared sand, purchasing the necessary momentum of the invasion with their own violent destruction. By mid-morning, across the wide stretches of Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches, the profound strategic impact of this attritional engineering was undeniable. The German defenders, battered by the continuing naval gunfire and exhausted by the relentless, surging infantry assaults, watched their meticulously designed coastal fortress crumble in a way they had never anticipated in their tactical manuals. The rough sea had not drowned the approaching tanks. The expansive minefields had been violently beaten into safe lanes by spinning chains. The deep anti-tank ditches had been bridged with steel and compressed timber. The indestructible concrete bunkers had been cracked open from the outside by 40-pound flying explosives, and the impassable, deliberately bottlenecked exits had been forcibly bulldozed wide open by unarmed tractors wrapped in steel. The climax of the morning on these beaches represented a fundamental, historic shift in the very logic of mechanized warfare. For centuries of military history, the defending army always held the ultimate tactical advantage of selecting and preparing the terrain. They built the fortifications, they dug the deep trenches, and they forced the attacking army to bleed and die in prepared, static killing zones. The defender always dictated the geography of the battle. But on the morning of June 6th, the attacker had brought the heavy industrial capacity to physically alter the geography while actively under direct fire. The Allies had brought equipment specifically capable of carrying bridges, filling chasms, detonating hidden traps, and turning impassable ground into a functional, heavily trafficked highway. The rigid mathematical certainty of the Atlantic Wall had been completely dismantled by specialized, mobile engineering. The lethal terrain itself had been neutralized. Major General Percy Hobart's eccentric, fiercely debated vision of an armored vanguard composed entirely of strange, specialized, problem-solving machines had undeniably proven its immense tactical worth. On the British and Canadian beaches, the bizarre Funnies had suffered heavy, agonizing losses, but they had successfully torn open the vital pathways inland, allowing the massive invasion force to firmly secure their bridgeheads. But this highly coordinated mechanical dismantling of the Atlantic Wall was only happening on one specific side of the massive invasion front. The deployment of the 79th Armored Division was a specific tactical and logistical choice made primarily by the British and Canadian commands. A few miles further west along the French coastline, under the exact same grim, gray morning sky, a completely different military doctrine was violently unfolding. While the British beaches were crawling with flails, bridge layers, AVREs, and armored bulldozers methodically taking apart the defenses, what was happening on the American beaches, where this bizarre, highly specialized arsenal was notably absent. On the sprawling crescent of Omaha Beach, the reality of the Atlantic Wall rapidly reasserted its brutal, mathematical logic. The American command had largely declined the use of the bizarre, highly specialized Funnies, opting instead to rely on conventional combat engineers and amphibious duplex drive, or DD, Sherman tanks. The tactical plan required these floating tanks to hit the sand first, providing immediate covering fire while unprotected naval demolition units manually cleared the steel obstacles. But the English Channel intervened. Hoping to protect the transport ships from coastal artillery, orders were given to launch the DD tanks roughly 6,000 yards offshore. It was a fatal miscalculation of the environment. The canvas flotation screens designed to keep the 30-ton Shermans buoyant were never meant to withstand the violently churning 6-foot ocean swells. The heavy machines were rapidly swamped by the freezing waves, In one sector alone, out of 29 tanks launched into the deep water, 27 sank straight to the bottom. The sea, the very first layer of the German defense, had perfectly executed its design without a single shot being fired. With the armor swallowed by the ocean, the infantry arriving on the sand faced exactly the nightmare scenario Erwin Rommel had meticulously planned. There were no flail tanks to beat a safe path through the explosives. There were no heavy AVREs to hurl demolition charges at the concrete bunkers. The entire burden of dismantling the deadly coastal geometry fell onto the shoulders of deeply vulnerable men carrying satchel charges and primacord. Army engineers and naval combat demolition units were forced to wade through the surf under withering, overlapping machine gun fire. They had to manually wire the steel hedgehogs and wooden ramps with explosives, attempting to blow lanes clear for the incoming boats. It was an agonizing, exposed struggle where a single German artillery shell striking a bundle of detonators could erase an entire engineering team in an instant. This desperate reality shatters the comforting myth that the invasion was won simply because the Allies brought invincible miracle machines. Technology was never a magic solution. Even the few standard tank dozers and conventional bulldozers that managed to reach the American sector were immediately recognized by German gunners and prioritized for destruction. Operators were killed in their exposed cabs, and their vital earth-moving equipment was left burning in the rising tide. At Omaha, the sequential engineering problem of the Atlantic Wall was not solved by armored bridge layers or spinning chains. It was solved by staggering human sacrifice. Men crawled over the shingle, pushing Bangalore torpedoes through the barbed wire by hand, while surviving engineers desperately jury-rigged disabled bulldozers under direct fire just to push the debris aside. Yet, despite the catastrophic failure of the amphibious armor and the horrific casualties suffered by the demolition teams, the forces on the sand slowly began to carve their own bloody exits inland. Which forces a profound question. If the meticulously designed German obstacles could be breached by specialized engineering marvels in one sector, and by the sheer, desperate endurance of unsupported engineers in another, how did this collective realization completely break the underlying defensive logic of the entire Atlantic Wall? The underlying defensive logic of the Atlantic Wall broke because, for the very first time in modern military history, an attacking army completely refused to accept the battlefield exactly as it was presented to them. For centuries, the fundamental rule of siege warfare was absolute. The defending force dictates the geography. The defender chooses the ground, excavates the trenches, pours the concrete, and carefully measures the kill zones. The attacker is then forced to bleed for every yard of that prepared, static terrain. Erwin Rommel's coastal fortress was the ultimate, industrialized expression of this ancient doctrine. The Germans believed that by weaponizing the French coastline, they could strip away the attacker's momentum, force them into pre-calculated bottlenecks, and systematically slaughter them. But as the morning of June 6 bled into the afternoon, the German artillery spotters and bunker commanders realized their rigid mathematical equations were failing. The Allies had not just brought tanks and infantry to fight German soldiers. They had brought a mobile industrial capacity to wage war against the terrain itself. This was a terrifying paradigm shift. The attackers were mechanically dismantling the geography while actively taking heavy fire. When a heavily armored bridge layer reached a deep anti-tank ditch, it didn't look for a way around. It dropped tons of steel and timber directly into the chasm, turning a lethal trap into a functional highway. When an armored bulldozer hit a concrete roadblock, it simply dropped its massive blade and shoved the impassable barricade out of the way. The Allies were physically rewriting the map of the coastline in real time, directly under the sights of the German guns. Crucially, the ultimate success of this monumental engineering feat did not rely on the survival of the machines themselves. The beach rapidly became a sprawling graveyard of burning, immobilized, and shattered specialized armor. But in the ruthless calculus of the invasion, even a destroyed vehicle was a tactical triumph if it died completing its specific task. If a flail tank violently beat a path through a dense minefield before being gutted by an 88mm shell, that narrow, cleared lane remained permanently open. If a specialized heavy mortar tank managed to crack the reinforced face of a concrete pillbox before its own internal ammunition detonated, that sector's crossfire was permanently silenced. Even the smoking, ruined chassis of a bogged-down engineering vehicle served a vital purpose. acting as a massive steel shield for the terrified infantry crawling up the exposed sand. The defensive network was not elegantly bypassed. It was fed a diet of specialized steel until its gears jammed. The Allies broke the German meat grinder by willingly sacrificing machines that were designed for a single, suicidal purpose. Through these narrow, violently carved fractures in the German line, the true weight of the invasion finally poured inland. Once the first gaps were forced open, whether by the bizarre, chain-whipping marvels of Hobart's Funnies on the British and Canadian sectors, or by the agonizing, manual sacrifice of combat engineers in the surf of Omaha, the static nature of the Atlantic Wall turned completely against its creators. A decentralized network of strongpoints only works if the obstacles hold the enemy in place. Once those obstacles are mechanically bridged, bulldozed, and detonated, the surviving concrete bunkers are instantly outflanked, isolated, and rendered entirely useless. By dismantling the traps, the Allies fundamentally altered the rules of engagement. They proved that no amount of static concrete, buried explosives, or welded steel could stop an army equipped with the industrial tools to tear the battlefield apart, piece by piece. For years, the Third Reich had poured staggering resources into the French coastline. They diverted endless supply trains of raw materials, utilized immense labor forces, and consumed millions of cubic meters of reinforced concrete to construct a masterclass in static defense. The entire German high command had gambled the survival of their occupation in Western Europe on one fundamental assumption: that any invading army would be forced to play by the rules of this meticulously engineered geography. They built a battlefield specifically designed to paralyze a conventional armored assault, confident that the terrain itself would do the heavy lifting of destroying the enemy. The ultimate meaning of the Normandy landings lies in the Allies' outright refusal to accept those terms. Rather than hurling conventional forces into a pre-calculated slaughter, they analyzed the lethal geometry of the coast and transformed every single defensive feature into a separate, solvable engineering problem. If a ditch was too wide, they brought a machine designed solely to carry a bridge. If a concrete wall was too thick, they brought a mortar specifically designed to crack it. If an exit was blocked, they brought an armored tractor to push the debris aside. They met an industrialized fortress with a dedicated, industrialized deconstruction crew. However, it is crucial to recognize that the Atlantic Wall as a whole did not simply vanish within mere hours on D-Day. The defensive network was far too massive and deeply entrenched for a single, sweeping collapse. While the specialized armor and combat engineers managed to pry open vital doors on the beaches, allowing the invasion force to surge inland, the wider coastal fortress remained a formidable threat. Countless individual strongpoints, isolated radar stations, and deeply buried artillery batteries continued to fight viciously for days. Furthermore, the major deep-water ports that anchored the Atlantic Wall, fortified cities like Cherbourg and Brest, did not surrender on the morning of June 6th. They required brutal, protracted sieges and a massive expenditure of ammunition over the following weeks and months before they were finally subdued. Yet, despite the grueling battles that remained, the strategic foundation of the German coastal defense was irreversibly broken on the sand. The illusion of an impenetrable fortress, entirely reliant on fixed physical obstacles and static kill zones, was permanently shattered. The German military had trusted in the absolute permanence of their engineering, but the Allies proved that no barrier is truly impassable when an attacking force possesses the specialized tools, the mechanical brute force, and the grim endurance to systematically unwrite the map of the battlefield. The Atlantic Wall did not disappear on June 6, 1944. The Allies did something much more dangerous. They learned how to dismantle it, piece by piece, while the attack was still underway. The German High Command spent years and millions of tons of concrete trying to freeze the battlefield in place. They built a static monument to defensive warfare, entirely reliant on the premise that geography could not be altered under heavy fire. But the twisted steel, shattered bunkers, and sunken fascines left behind in the Normandy sand proved the era of the impenetrable fortress was dead. The invasion succeeded because an entirely new doctrine of combat engineering refused to accept the terrain as it was found. The coastline remained heavily scarred, and isolated strongpoints would continue fighting for months. The Atlantic Wall did not disappear on June 6, 1944. The Allies did something much more dangerous. They learned how to dismantle it piece by piece while the attack was still underway.